sharp blend of wax linoleum, old textbooks, and cafeteria grease that clung to the walls no matter how many windows were opened. I was 17 then, caught between boyhood and manhood, and in the midst of everything that defined that strange, restless time of adolescence, I had two anchors, Jason and Michael. They weren't just my best friends, they were more like my brothers, bound to me not by blood, but by the kind of loyalty forged only in the trenches of growing up together in a small town where secrets always seemed to float just beneath the surface. Our high school, Crestwood High, wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a square block of brick with faded blue doors, but to us it was the world. Inside those walls, we lived out the dramas that felt bigger than life. Football games under the lights, whispered crushes exchanged in between classes, the sting of failing a math test, the relief of hearing the final bell. Yet that world, so ordinary in appearance, was where something extraordinary happened. Something terrible. Something I can't let go, even all these years later. Jason was the loud one of the group. He was always cracking jokes, his laugh carrying across the hallway like a firecracker, impossible to ignore. His hair was always a mess, his shirt always untucked, and he had that fearless way of walking into any room like he owned it. Michael was the opposite. Quiet, cautious, and serious. Where Jason would rush into a fight or a prank without a second thought, Michael would linger behind, calculating, watching, as though he already knew how things would unravel. And me? I was somewhere in between. I tried to balance Jason's chaos and Michael's order, though I never really succeeded. Together, we were inseparable, a trio always spotted together in the cafeteria, in the bleachers, on the sidewalks of our town. Teachers rolled their eyes when they saw us together because we couldn't help but stir trouble, even when we weren't trying. The day they vanished began like any other. The spring air was warm, the sun already high as we walked to school, tossing jokes and insults back and forth the way boys do when they don't yet know how to say they love each other. We sat through first and second period, restless as always, planning out the weekend ahead. Jason wanted to sneak into the abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town, claiming he'd heard stories of strange noises at night. Michael rolled his eyes, already dismissing it as nonsense, but I could see that spark of curiosity he could never completely hide. That was the thing about the three of us. No matter how different we were, none of us could resist the pull of a mystery. By the time lunch rolled around, we were already plotting out how we'd get there without our parents finding out. But that plan never came to life. Instead, the last time I ever saw Jason and Michael, we were standing outside the gym, Jason leaning against the wall with that crooked grin of his, Michael with his backpack slung over one shoulder, looking thoughtful. I can still see them, frozen in my mind like a photograph. And then just like that, they were gone. The confusion, at first, was brushed off. Kids skip class all the time, teachers said. Maybe they'd gone off somewhere together. Maybe they'd ditched school. Maybe they were hiding out just to stir up trouble. But I knew better. Jason was impulsive, yes, but not stupid. Michael was careful to a fault. They wouldn't just vanish in the middle of the day without telling me, without leaving some kind of signal. We had our unspoken rules, little codes we used when sneaking out of class or slipping away from the cafeteria. But there was nothing. Not a note. Not a word. Just silence. By the time the final bell rang and neither of them appeared at the bus stop, I felt the first real chill of fear sink into my stomach. I walked home alone, every step heavy, convinced I'd find them waiting on the porch of my house or calling my phone with some wild story. But the hours turned into days and then weeks and still nothing. The town erupted into search parties. Flyers went up on every telephone pole, Jason and Michael's faces staring out in black and white photocopies that never seemed to capture their real spark. The police questioned everyone, including me, over and over again. Where had I last seen them? What were we talking about that morning? Had they mentioned going somewhere? I told them everything I could remember, every detail, no matter how small, but nothing ever led anywhere. The school halls felt hollow without them. The cafeteria table where we always sat turned into a monument of absence. People moved on faster than I expected, as though two boys could vanish into thin air and life could simply keep moving. But I couldn't. I carried their absence with me like a shadow. Nights became sleepless, haunted by dreams of them calling my name from somewhere far away, their voices muffled, like they were trapped behind walls I couldn't break through. Years passed. I graduated, though it hardly felt like a victory. I left Crestwood for college, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the memory of that day. Every news story about missing persons pulled me back. Every field or forest I passed on long drives felt like a possible graveyard of secrets. The police had long closed the case, labeling it a cold file. Their names faded from headlines, their faces from the walls. People whispered less and less about them until only I seemed to remember. I felt like a ghost of my own, carrying their memory while the rest of the world forgot. And then, 8 years later, the fire came. It was summer, the heat pressing down like a weight on the fields outside of town. I had moved back after college, unable to resist the gravity of the place where it had all begun, even though it suffocated me. The fire started small, they said, a spark in the dry grass, carried by the wind. But it spread fast, devouring acres of land in a matter of hours. I stood with the rest of the town at the edge of the smoke, watching as firefighters battled to contain the blaze. Flames licked the sky, black smoke rolling like storm clouds. It felt apocalyptic, like the earth itself was purging something it had long buried. And in a way it was. When the fire finally burned out, when the smoke cleared and the ash settled, what it revealed beneath the charred remains of that field made every memory, every suspicion, every sleepless night come rushing back to me with a force so strong I nearly collapsed. When the fire was finally contained, the town gathered around the scorched field like mourners circling a grave. I remember the acrid smell of burnt earth, that sharp bite of smoke still heavy in the air, clinging to our clothes, stinging our eyes. The firefighters were exhausted, streaked in soot, their uniforms blackened, but they were quiet too, as if they sensed something in the ashes that went beyond the destruction of a simple wildfire. And then, as the bulldozers began to clear the charred debris, the first discovery came. At first, it was just the outline of something pale against the blackened ground, the unmistakable curve of bone. A hush fell over the crowd as word spread. People craned their necks, whispering, some already turning away. By the time the authorities cordoned off the area, rumors had already bloomed. Old graves uncovered by the flames, the remains of settlers from long ago, or maybe even evidence of foul play long hidden beneath the earth. But when the sheriff called me late that night, his voice hoarse and uneven, I knew before he said the words that the fire had revealed something I had feared for 8 long years. The remains were found in a shallow pit, no more than 3 feet below the surface. What shocked the investigators wasn't just that the bones had been buried there, but how close the site was to Crestwood High. The field bordered the back of the school grounds, an overgrown lot most of us never paid much attention to. We used to cut through it sometimes, hopping the fence after practice or lying in the tall grass to watch the stars. Jason had once claimed he saw strange lights there at night, and of course we'd all laughed it off. But now, as investigators combed through the soil with gloved hands, pulling out scraps of clothing half turned to ash, the laughter of those days felt cruel, almost unbearable. The sheriff told me privately that they had found enough to confirm that the remains belonged to Jason and Michael. Fragments of Jason's dental records matched one skull, and the watch Michael always wore, a gift from his father, had been pulled out from the soot-stained dirt. There was no denying it anymore. My best friends hadn't vanished into thin air. They had been here all along, hidden just behind the place where we'd spent our youth. The town went into shock. The story hit the local news within hours, then spiraled outward to national headlines. Suddenly Crestwood, long forgotten by the world, was a spotlight of tragedy once again. Reporters swarmed the streets, their cameras flashing outside the school gates, their microphones thrust into the faces of grieving neighbors who hadn't spoken about the boys in years. People came forward with their own theories, their suspicions, their half-remembered stories. Some said they'd always believed it was a kidnapping. Others swore they'd seen strange cars around the field that spring of 2004. The police reopened the case, this time with a ferocity that hadn't existed when the boys first disappeared. It was no longer a mystery of where they had gone, but of who had put them in the ground. For me, the revelation was both a wound reopened and a twisted kind of closure. I spent nights replaying every detail of that day they vanished, wondering how close I had been to the truth, how blind I had been to what lurked just beyond the fence. I kept hearing their voices in my head, Jason's laugh echoing, Michael's cautious tone urging us to think before acting. Sometimes I would wake drenched in sweat, convinced I could feel them still lying there beneath the earth, calling out to me, demanding to know why I hadn't found them sooner. The guilt gnawed at me in ways I can't put into simple words. I began visiting the site almost daily once the authorities cleared it, standing at the edge of the blackened dirt, staring at the empty hollow where their bodies had been unearthed. Some people said it was morbid that I needed to move on, but I couldn't. To me, it felt like the last tether connecting me to them, the last chance to understand what had really happened. The investigation that followed peeled back layers of our town's history that many would have preferred to keep buried. Secrets spilled out with the same violence as the fire that had unearthed the boys. Teachers were questioned, old classmates interviewed, janitors and staff from the school dragged back into the spotlight. The authorities wanted to know who had access to the field, who might have known its hidden corners, who had reason to lure two teenage boys there on that spring afternoon. For the first time in years, I found myself sitting across from detectives again, their notebooks open, their eyes heavy with suspicion. They asked me to recount every word Jason and Michael had spoken that day, to describe their mood, their plans, their arguments. I told them what I could, but memory is a tricky thing. After so many years, the details blurred, the edges softened. And yet there were moments that remained sharp, too sharp, like the way Jason had been unusually restless that morning, tapping his pencil against the desk as if his body couldn't keep still, or how Michael had seemed distracted, staring out the window with an expression I couldn't read. Theories swirled everywhere. Some believed it had been a teacher, someone in authority who had preyed upon their trust. Others whispered about the janitor who left town abruptly the year after their disappearance. There were even rumors of cult activity, whispers of strange. When the fire was finally contained, the town gathered around the scorched field like mourners circling a grave. I remember the acrid smell of burnt earth, that sharp bite of smoke still heavy in the air, clinging to our clothes, stinging our eyes. The firefighters were exhausted, streaked in soot, their uniforms blackened, but they were quiet too, as if they sensed something in the ashes that went beyond the destruction of a simple wildfire. And then, as the bulldozers began to clear the charred debris, the first discovery came. At first, it was just the outline of something pale against the blackened ground, the unmistakable curve of bone. A hush fell over the crowd as word spread. People craned their necks, whispering, some already turning away. By the time the authorities cordoned off the area, rumors had already bloomed, old graves uncovered by the flames, the remains of settlers from long ago, or maybe even evidence of foul play long hidden beneath the earth. But when the sheriff called me late that night, his voice hoarse and uneven, I knew before he said the words that the fire had revealed something I had feared for 8 long years. The remains were found in a shallow pit, no more than 3 feet below the surface. What shocked the investigators wasn't just that the bones had been buried there, but how close the site was to Crestwood High. The field bordered the back of the school grounds, an overgrown lot most of us never paid much attention to. We used to cut through it sometimes, hopping the fence after practice or lying in the tall grass to watch the stars. Jason had once claimed he saw strange lights there at night, and of course we'd all laughed it off. But now, as investigators combed through the soil with gloved hands, pulling out scraps of clothing half-turned to ash, the laughter of those days felt cruel, almost unbearable. The sheriff told me privately that they had found enough to confirm that the remains belonged to Jason and Michael. Fragments of Jason's dental records matched one skull, and the watch Michael always wore, a gift from his father, had been pulled out from the soot-stained dirt. There was no denying it anymore. My best friends hadn't vanished into thin air. They had been here all along, hidden just behind the place where we'd spent our youth. The town went into shock. The story hit the local news within hours, then spiraled outward to national headlines. Suddenly Crestwood, long forgotten by the world, was a spotlight of tragedy once again. Reporters swarmed the streets, their cameras flashing outside the school gates, their microphones thrust into the faces of grieving neighbors who hadn't spoken about the boys in years. People came forward with their own theories, their suspicions, their half-remembered stories. Some said they'd always believed it was a kidnapping. Others swore they'd seen strange cars around the field that spring of 2004. The police reopened the case, this time with a ferocity that hadn't existed when the boys first disappeared. It was no longer a mystery of where they had gone, but of who had put them in the ground. For me, the revelation was both a wound reopened and a twisted kind of closure. I spent nights replaying every detail of that day they vanished, wondering how close I had been to the truth, how blind I had been to what lurked just beyond the fence. I kept hearing their voices in my head, Jason's laugh echoing, Michael's cautious tone urging us to think before acting. Sometimes I would wake drenched in sweat, convinced I could feel them still lying there beneath the earth, calling out to me, demanding to know why I hadn't found them sooner. The guilt gnawed at me in ways I can't put into simple words. I began visiting the site almost daily once the authorities cleared it, standing at the edge of the blackened dirt, staring at the empty hollow where their bodies had been unearthed. Some people said it was morbid that I needed to move on, but I couldn't. To me, it felt like the last tether connecting me to them, the last chance to understand what had really happened. The investigation that followed peeled back layers of our town's history that many would have preferred to keep buried. Secrets spilled out with the same violence as the fire that had unearthed the boys. Teachers were questioned, old classmates interviewed, janitors and staff from the school dragged back into the spotlight. The authorities wanted to know who had access to the field, who might have known its hidden corners, who had reason to lure 2 teenage boys there on that spring afternoon. For the first time in years, I found myself sitting across from detectives again, their notebooks open, their eyes heavy with suspicion. They asked me to recount every word Jason and Michael had spoken that day, to describe their mood, their plans, their arguments. I told them what I could, but memory is a tricky thing. After so many years, the details blurred, the edges softened. And yet there were moments that remained sharp, too sharp, like the way Jason had been unusually restless that morning, tapping his pencil against the desk as if his body couldn't keep still, or how Michael had seemed distracted, staring out the window with an expression I couldn't read. Theories swirled everywhere. Some believed it had been a teacher, someone in authority who had preyed upon their trust. Others whispered about the janitor who left town abruptly the year after their disappearance. There were even rumors of cult activity, whispers of strange symbols found carved into the trees beyond the field, though the police never confirmed it. I found myself sucked into the whirlwind, spending hours online reading every theory, every article, every half-baked piece of speculation. It consumed me, the need to know, the need to fill in the yawning gaps that stretched between the last time I saw my friends alive and the moment their remains were pulled from the ground. I started drinking more, sleeping less, wandering the town at night as though the shadows themselves might cough up an answer. My parents worried, my co-workers whispered, but none of it mattered. The fire had ripped open a wound I had learned to live with, and now I couldn't stop bleeding. Then came the evidence, the kind that changes everything. The police announced that, buried alongside the remains, they had discovered something else. Not just the watch, not just fragments of clothing, but an object that didn't belong to either Jason or Michael. It was a small, rusted padlock, broken open, its jagged edge sharp with corrosion. The detectives didn't explain its significance at first, but word spread quickly that it matched locks once used on the basement doors of Crestwood High. Suddenly, the field and the school were no longer separate places, but linked by a chain of possibility. Had Jason and Michael been lured into the school basement? Had something happened there before their bodies were moved just yards away? That revelation shifted the town's collective fear into something darker, heavier. Parents looked at teachers differently. Students whispered about the locked rooms beneath the school where supplies were kept, imagining horrors that might have taken place there. And I I couldn't stop imagining it either. I'd walked those same basement corridors during fire drills, during basketball games when we used the back entrance, never once thinking they might be connected to something monstrous. I started sneaking back to the school at night, circling its brick walls, staring at the boarded-up basement windows as if they might open and tell me what had happened. What haunted me most wasn't just the discovery of their remains, but the realization that someone I had passed in the halls, someone I had perhaps greeted or even trusted, might have been the one responsible. That knowledge was like poison in my veins. It made me distrustful of everyone, angry at the world, and endlessly haunted by the possibility that the truth was closer than I wanted to admit. The weeks following the discovery were a blur of police sirens, news vans, and sleepless nights. Crestwood had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors waved from porches. But now it felt like the air itself had changed, charged, heavy, suffocating with suspicion. People avoided eye contact in the grocery store, whispers followed every conversation, and the school that once represented safety had become a looming reminder of betrayal. I couldn't escape the feeling that the walls of that building had absorbed secrets for years, that behind its bland brick facade lay answers no one had dared to uncover. Every time I drove past it, I slowed down, my eyes drawn to the basement windows sealed with wooden boards, the fire exit doors chained shut. I found myself circling the block, parking in the lot after dark just to stare at it, as if the building itself might confess if I gave it enough silence. The police investigation intensified, though to the outside world it looked like chaos. Detectives swarmed through the school archives, digging up old attendance records, maintenance logs, and disciplinary reports. They interviewed teachers from 2004, many of whom had long since retired or moved away. A few came back reluctantly, faces pale with age and unease, while others refused to comment, citing failing memories. I attended as many community meetings as I could, sitting in the back row, listening as the sheriff outlined progress that felt slow and unsatisfying. They spoke of forensic analysis, DNA confirmation, reconstruction of timelines, but none of it gave me the one thing I needed: a face, a name, someone to hold accountable. In my desperation, I began conducting my own investigation. Maybe it was reckless, maybe it was madness, but grief and guilt have a way of convincing you that you must act when no one else will. I went back to old classmates, knocking on doors, asking questions I should have asked 8 years ago. I tracked down teachers who had retired to other towns, phoned them, met them in diners off highways, pushed past their reluctance until they gave me something, anything. Most claimed they remembered little. Some said they thought Jason and Michael had been troublemakers destined for mischief. Others admitted they suspected foul play from the start but were discouraged from saying anything too wild without proof. It was in these fragmented recollections that I began to piece together a picture, not of Jason or Michael, but of the strange undercurrents that had always existed at Crestwood High. One teacher in particular, Mrs. Garrison, stuck with me. She was a history teacher, sharp-eyed even in her old age, and she met me at a quiet diner booth, her hands trembling as she stirred her coffee. She told me that back in 2004, the school had gone through a series of budget cuts that forced many staff changes. Several janitors were let go abruptly, and one of them, a man named Walter Briggs, had made her uneasy. She described him as distant, often lingering in the hallways long after everyone had left. He was in his late 40s then, unmarried, with a history no one seemed to know much about. "I used to see him by the back field sometimes," she whispered, her eyes darting around as though afraid the walls might be listening. "He'd stand there, smoking, just staring out into the grass. I always thought it was strange, but I didn't say anything." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Briggs had left town a year after Jason and Michael disappeared. No one knew where he went. Fueled by this lead, I dove deeper. I went to the county records office, combed through old employment files, searched for traces of Briggs. What I found was unsettling. Multiple complaints filed against him, though never escalated. Missing supplies, unlocked doors after hours, even rumors of students feeling watched. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to keep my mind spinning. Could it have been him? Could he have been the one who lured Jason and Michael into the basement or the field? The thought consumed me, but the trail ran cold. Briggs had vanished from records after 2006, as if he'd stepped off the map entirely. Meanwhile, the community itself was fracturing. Parents pulled their kids from the school, demanding answers. Town meetings turned into shouting matches between those who believed in wild conspiracies and those begging for reason. Some insisted it had to be an outsider, a drifter passing through. Others pointed fingers at teachers, coaches, even the principal at the time. For me, the accusations hardly mattered. All I could think about was how close I had been that day, how easily I might have been taken with them if not for some twist of chance. Survivor's guilt isn't just a phrase. It's a weight, heavy and crushing, and it pressed harder with every headline, every theory. At night, I began dreaming of the field again. Not as it looked after the fire, but how it had been in 2004. Wild with tall grass, humming with insects, the air thick with the scent of summer. In the dreams, Jason and Michael stood at the edge, waving at me, their faces blurred by sunlight. Sometimes they called out, their voices distant, muffled, as though coming from underground. I would run toward them, only for the ground to open beneath my feet, pulling me into darkness. I'd wake gasping, heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat. It was as if my subconscious knew what I refused to admit, that no matter how many bones were unearthed, the truth was still buried. The police eventually announced that the fire had done more than reveal the remains. It had exposed fragments of fabric, rope, and even metal restraints scattered near the burial site. They believed Jason and Michael had been held captive, however briefly, before being killed. The image tore at me. I pictured Jason, wild and defiant even in the face of danger, trying to break free. I pictured Michael, calm and calculating, whispering plans of escape. I couldn't stop imagining their last moments, and each time, I felt like I had failed them all over again. One night, unable to bear the silence of my apartment, I drove back to the school. I parked near the chain-link fence and sat in the car, engine off, watching the shadows of the buildings stretch long under the moonlight. The town was asleep, the roads empty, but the school seemed alive, breathing, holding its secrets in its brick lungs. I don't know what compelled me, but I got out and walked toward the back, toward the boarded-up basement doors. The air was thick with humidity, the grass still scorched from the fire. I pressed my hand against the wood covering the door, half expecting to feel warmth, as though the past itself still smoldered behind it. In that moment, I swore I heard something, a faint echo, like footsteps, or maybe just the wind moving through the cracks. My pulse hammered in my throat. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move, until finally I turned and walked away. But from that night on, I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever had happened to Jason and Michael didn't end in that field. The school itself was part of it. And I wasn't going to stop until I forced it to confess. The summer after the fire stretched on endlessly, a season that should have been filled with barbecues, ball games, and late-night drives, but instead felt like a prolonged wake for a truth no one wanted to face. Every time I left my apartment, I caught sight of Jason and Michael's faces, on the news, on the memorial posters that still clung to poles in the rain, and in the eyes of strangers who remembered me as the boy who was with them. I became a living reminder of what had happened, a shadow that people both pitied and avoided. But I didn't care about their stares or their whispers. I cared only about the school, the field, and the possibility that something darker was woven into the fabric of Crestwood itself. I started going to the library every day, combing through old newspaper archives, searching for anything unusual about the school, the field, or the people tied to it. What I discovered wasn't a single smoking gun, but a pattern that unsettled me more than I expected. Over the decades, Crestwood High had its share of missing items, break-ins, and incidents that never made the front page. In the 1980s, 2 freshmen went missing for an entire night and were found the next morning, dazed, wandering near the same field where Jason and Michael would later be discovered. In the early 1990s, rumors circulated about a hidden tunnel connecting the school basement to the grounds, though the administration denied it existed. Teachers came and went, some leaving abruptly under vague circumstances. None of it was conclusive, but together it painted a picture of a place that had always carried shadows just beneath the surface. My obsession deepened. I spoke to alumni, people who had attended Crestwood long before me. Some laughed at my questions, dismissing me as a paranoid adult chasing ghosts. But others, especially those who had spent long hours in the building after dark, confessed to things that made my skin crawl. One man, a janitor in the late 80s, admitted that he sometimes heard muffled noises in the basement long after everyone had gone home. He claimed he found doors unlocked that were supposed to be sealed, storage rooms with objects moved as if someone had been inside. He told me he quit suddenly after seeing what he described as a figure standing at the end of the hall, watching. He never reported it, never told anyone until me, but the fear in his voice was real. It wasn't just alumni. Students who had graduated around the time of Jason and Michael's disappearance were called odd things too. Teachers who acted overly protective of certain rooms, a sudden lockdown one afternoon with no real explanation, whispers of initiation games that never got spoken of openly. Some of these stories were probably exaggerated, I knew that, but still, there was a consistency to them, a thread tying them all together. And every thread led back to the basement, the field, the space between what was visible and what was hidden. One evening, as the summer stormed outside, I pulled out an old box of my own keepsakes from high school. Inside were photographs, Polaroids of football games, candid shots of Jason's grinning face, Michael's more serious stare. Buried beneath them, I found a folded piece of paper, a note I had almost forgotten. It was from Jason, written during class one day, teasing me about a crush, but in the corner, almost as an afterthought, he had scribbled, "Field. After school. Don't forget." I stared at those words for a long time, my chest tightening. Could it have been the same day he disappeared? Was this a message I had ignored? I tried to remember, but my memory betrayed me, offering only fragments. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jason had left me a clue, and I had failed to see it until it was far too late. The guilt became unbearable, but it also hardened into determination. I decided I couldn't rely on the police anymore. Their investigation felt sluggish, hampered by bureaucracy, their updates vague and unsatisfying. If I wanted answers, I would have to find them myself. So, I did something reckless. I broke into Crestwood High. It was a humid night in late August when I parked my car down the street, waited for the patrol to pass, and slipped through the side fence. The building loomed in the darkness, its windows reflecting the pale glow of the streetlights. I had walked these halls 1,000 times as a student, but stepping inside as an intruder was something else entirely. My flashlight beam cut through the dust, illuminating lockers that hadn't been opened in years, bulletin boards still cluttered with faded announcements. The silence was oppressive, pressing against my ears until even the creak of my footsteps felt deafening. I moved carefully, heart pounding, every shadow seeming to lunge at me as I made my way toward the basement doors. The locks were newer, heavy with fresh chains, but I came prepared. With bolt cutters in hand, I snapped through them, the sound echoing through the hollow corridors. The door groaned as I pushed it open, and the smell hit me first, damp, mold, and something metallic, like rust and old blood. The air was colder down there, unnaturally so, and as I descended the stairs, I felt like I was stepping out of time itself. My flashlight revealed rows of storage shelves cluttered with broken desks, boxes of outdated textbooks, and forgotten supplies. But it wasn't the clutter that caught my attention, it was the markings. Scratched into the concrete walls, faint but deliberate, were initials. Dozens of them. Names, dates, some going back decades. My heart stuttered as I ran my fingers over them, my mind racing. Were these graffiti from bored students, or something more sinister? Deeper in the basement, I found a door that had been boarded shut from the outside. It took me nearly half an hour to pry it open, the wood splintering under my crowbar. Inside was a small, windowless room, barely large enough for two people to stand comfortably. The walls were lined with more scratches. Only these weren't initials. They were marks. Tallies. Countless lines etched into the surface, crossing over one another until the concrete was scarred. I staggered back, ball rising in my throat. Whoever had been in this room had been counting days or victims. I left the basement shaken, my mind spiraling with fear and certainty. Someone had used those rooms, someone had locked my friends or others down there. And if that was true, then their burial in the field wasn't random. It was deliberate, a message or a cover-up. I reported what I had found to the police anonymously, too afraid they'd dismiss me if I admitted I'd broken in. But even as I waited for them to act, I knew it wouldn't be enough. The truth was still buried, not in ash this time, but in silence. And silence, I had come to learn, was the most dangerous weapon of all. The discovery of that hidden room in the basement changed something in me. Until then, my obsession had been driven by grief, guilt, and unanswered questions. But now, for the first time, I felt like I had touched the edges of the truth. I couldn't shake the image of those tallies carved into the concrete, lines stacked upon lines, a silent scream from whoever had once been trapped there. It wasn't just Jason and Michael anymore. It was others, maybe countless others, whose names had been swallowed by Crestwood's silence. The thought terrified me, but it also gave me purpose. My friends weren't simply unlucky victims of a one-time crime. They were part of a pattern, a story bigger than any of us had imagined. And I was determined to follow that story to the end, no matter the cost. Of course, obsession comes at a price. My job began to slip. I showed up late, distracted, my mind always elsewhere. My parents stopped asking how I was doing because they already knew the answer. Friends, what few I had left, avoided me altogether. I became that man, the one who haunted the library archives, the one you crossed the street to avoid because you didn't want to get dragged into his endless theories. But I didn't care. Every lead, every scrap of information, every memory from the past felt like a breadcrumb on the trail to truth. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit with a map of the town spread across my table, marking places tied to rumors or incidents, lines connecting them until the entire sheet looked like a web. And at the center of that web was always Crestwood High. The police did eventually investigate the basement after I tipped them off. They claimed to find nothing out of the ordinary, just old storage rooms, graffiti from students, harmless nonsense. When the sheriff announced this publicly, I wanted to scream. Hadn't they seen the tallies? Hadn't they felt the suffocating air of that small room, the weight of history pressing down like stone? I began to wonder if the police were incompetent or complicit. Crestwood was a small town, after all. People protected each other here. Secrets were buried not just in fields, but in loyalty, silence, and fear. The thought that someone in uniform might know the truth, but refuse to speak it gnawed at me worse than any nightmare. It was around this time that I reconnected with Sarah, a classmate who had graduated with us in 2004. She had been quiet back then, shy, someone who kept to herself. But when I bumped into her at the grocery store, she surprised me by asking if I still thought about Jason and Michael. No one asked me that anymore. Most avoided the subject like it was contagious. When I admitted that I thought about them every day, she nodded solemnly, as though confirming something to herself. A few nights later, she called me and confessed that she had seen something on the day they vanished. She had never told anyone, afraid of being dismissed or ridiculed, but she couldn't hold it in anymore, not after the fire. She told me she had been walking home that afternoon, cutting across the lot behind the school, when she saw Jason and Michael near the field. They weren't alone. A man was with them, older, taller, his face shadowed by the brim of a cap. At first, she thought it was a teacher, maybe someone supervising them, but something about the way the man moved unsettled her. He had his hand on Jason's shoulder, guiding him toward the trees, while Michael followed reluctantly. She remembered Jason laughing, like he always did when nervous, but Michael looked tense, on edge. Sarah had called out to them, but none of them turned around. She assumed they were in trouble, that it wasn't her place to interfere, so she walked on. That was the last she saw of them. Her words shook me to my core. An adult. A man leading them away. It fit too perfectly with the image I had built in my mind, with the rumors about the janitor, with the strange atmosphere that had always clung to that field. I pressed her for details, but she couldn't describe him clearly. Only the cap, the broad shoulders, the way he seemed to tower over them. She insisted she wasn't lying, that the memory had haunted her for years. I believed her. And yet, the revelation left me more tormented than ever. Who was he? Why hadn't anyone else seen him? And why had the police, with all their questioning, never uncovered her story? Together, Sarah and I began digging deeper. For the first time, I wasn't alone in my search. She helped me comb through yearbooks, identifying male staff members who matched her vague description. We tracked down addresses, followed dead ends, knocked on doors that slammed in our faces. It was exhausting, frustrating, and at times, terrifying. But in the quiet moments, when we sat surrounded by dusty files or maps, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the faintest flicker of hope. Not hope that Jason and Michael might still be alive. That illusion had died with the fire, but hope that their story might finally be told, that justice, however delayed, might still be possible. One night, Sarah admitted something that rattled me even more. She said she sometimes felt like someone was watching her. At first, she brushed it off as paranoia, but then she noticed a car parked across from her apartment on more than one occasion, headlights flickering on as soon as she stepped outside. She had received phone calls where the line went dead the moment she answered. Her mailbox had been rifled through. I wanted to tell her it was coincidence, that we were just scaring ourselves, but deep down I knew better. We were stirring something that had been buried for nearly a decade, and someone out there didn't want it unearthed. The fear only fueled us. We became more cautious, meeting in secret, sharing notes in code, watching our backs as though we were fugitives instead of truth seekers. I couldn't help but think of Jason and Michael, how they might have felt in their final moments, confused, scared, realizing too late that they had walked into a trap. And sometimes, late at night, I swore I could hear Jason's laugh again, faint and mocking, as if he were urging me forward, daring me to keep going no matter the cost. The weight of it all became unbearable at times, but I knew there was no turning back. Every lead, every revelation, every shadow we chased brought me closer to the truth. And I had sworn, silently and fiercely, that I would not rest until I uncovered the face of the man who had taken my friends away, even if it meant tearing the entire town apart brick by brick. Winter came slow that year, dragging its gray breath across the town like a reminder that time kept moving even when your world had collapsed. The nights were longer, and the cold made the memory sharper, as though the chill itself could etch every detail into my bones. Sarah and I kept working, even as everything else frayed. We met in diners with cracked vinyl booths, in her cramped living room surrounded by boxes, under the weak glow of desk lamps that buzzed while we spread out photos, notes, and copies of old maintenance records across any flat surface we could find. The more we dug, the more the story of Crestwood High unraveled into a tangle of people who had looked the other way, administrators who tolerated sloppy paperwork, coaches who covered for each other, and a generation of townsfolk who valued reputation over truth. It was maddening, the way loyalty had been weaponized to protect criminals, how a community could become its own jailer. A breakthrough came when we found an old maintenance ledger tucked behind a stack of vacuum cleaner bags in the county records room. It was brittle with age, the ink faded, but some diligent clerk long ago, had scrawled notes in the margins, dates, keys issued, odd references to basement use at strange hours. One entry from late April 2004 stuck out like a splinter, a key signed out by Walter Briggs for the basement storage, time logged as 3:15 p.m. I read it over and over until the numbers blurred. Briggs. The same name Mrs. Garrison had murmured in that diner years ago. My pulse spiked. I could feel the blood in my ears. It was the clearest breadcrumb we'd found, a document that placed him near the school that day. We photocopied it, snapped pictures with our phones, and carried that yellowed sheet like a talisman. For the first time since the fire revealed the graves, I felt the line tighten between suspicion and proof. But proof is a treacherous thing in small towns. Documentation can be dismissed, memories can be accused of failing, and the people who hold power can always muddy the waters. Briggs had disappeared from public records in 2006, but the ledger suggested he'd had access in 2004. We focused on tracing him, phone numbers, relatives, rental properties, but each lead evaporated. It felt like chasing smoke. Yet every dead end also taught me things, patterns of behavior, the names of men who would not speak without prodding, the way certain teachers flinched when the basement was mentioned. We learned to watch for those micro-expressions, the tiny tells that betray someone who knows more than they're saying. Someone else began to watch us as well. The warning started small, an empty envelope tucked under my windshield with nothing inside, a shadowy sedan that appeared and disappeared outside Sarah's apartment, the ringtone on my phone that would cut to static when I picked up. The fear that had once lingered in the corners of my life stepped forward, bold and personal. The sheriff's office offered perfunctory reassurances when I reported these things, but their eyes always slid away when I asked whether they believed Briggs or anyone else might be involved. Their unwillingness to look made me angrier than any anonymous threat. It convinced me that we were close enough to hurt someone's sense of safety and that someone would act to stop us. Then Sarah found the journal. It lay in a second-hand box at an estate sale on the edge of town, a battered composition book with the name, Walt, written on the inside cover in a cramped, adult hand. She brought it to me trembling, eyes wide and raw, like someone who had been handed a match in a dry forest. We opened it with gloved fingers. The handwriting inside was spidery, the ink blotched in places as if written in haste or under duress. At first the entries were banal. Notes about supplies, the schedule of maintenance, complaints about students leaving trash, but as we flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. There were entries about keeping order, references to the lads who don't listen, and, chillingly, an oblique passage about teaching them to be quiet. Dates lined up with the disappearance. One entry mentioned a lock and key used to keep them safe from themselves, and another, later entry, spoke of moving things out to the lot because it's easier when the field is quiet. My stomach rolled like a stormy sea. It was not a confession, not the neat end to a mystery, but it was direction. It was context. It was something that a defense attorney would ring out and call hearsay, and yet, in that battered notebook, my friend's fate breathed like a living thing. We took photographs of the journal and transcribed the most damning entries. I slept poorly that week, dreams a rapid montage of locked doors and razor-scraped concrete. The next morning, I carried the journal copies to the local paper. I had grown up learning the limits of gossip and rumor. Newspapers still had a kernel of respect in Crestwood. Maybe they would pry a story loose. Maybe an editor would run with it and force the sheriff to act. The editor, an older man named Frank who had once coached Little League with my father, looked at the pages in silence. I expected outrage, or at least curiosity, but his jaw tightened in a way that told me more than his words could. "This is dangerous," he said finally, voice low. "You know what this can do to people." He folded the pages and promised to look into it, but his expression left a hollow in my chest. The paper had its own ties. There were men in town who still bought influence, and Frank had a mortgage and a son who played for the same football team coached by the principal's brother. The ledger and the journal were truths with teeth, but in a town like ours, teeth could be blunted. Frustrated and terrified of inaction, Sarah and I decided to go public ourselves. We compiled a dossier. The ledger entry, photos of the journal, our notes from interviews, and a list of witnesses who had seen Briggs around the school in 2004. We posted it anonymously online and handed copies to a few trusted friends in neighboring towns, men and women who might pass it along to investigators who weren't so entwined with Crestwood's power structures. The reaction was immediate. People shared the dossier, anger flared on social media, and within days a local news crew arrived with bright lights and relentless questions. For a heartbeat it felt like the world had shifted. For once the sheriff couldn't ignore the pressure. And then came the backlash. Old alliances hardened. Parents who had once smiled at my face now glared when we walked into the grocery store. The principal, a man with a neat hairline and a face practiced in the art of bland apologies, issued a statement denying any wrongdoing and condemning the rumors. Someone posted photos of Sarah online with crude insinuations about her motives. Someone slashed the tires on my car in the middle of the night. Threats, both explicit and implied, arrived like winter sleet. It was a small price for truth, I told myself, but it was a price nonetheless. The town watched as we became pariahs for shining a light into a place they preferred to keep dim. Pressure mounted on the sheriff's office until they finally reopened the case in earnest. Detectives arrived from the state, people with badges that smelled of coffee and detachment, and they moved through Crestwood with a kind of clinical purpose that made my chest ache with relief. They took our copies of the journal and the ledger, but they warned us that such evidence might not be admissible in court without originals and without a chain of custody. Still, their presence felt like oxygen. They dug into old subpoenas, re-interviewed staff, looked at payrolls and maintenance logs with a fine-tooth comb. For a while, there was motion where there had been stagnation. I started to believe again that the long arc of justice might finally bend toward my friends. The turning point came with DNA. Forensic teams returned to the field, methodically sifting through what the fire hadn't consumed, reprocessing bone fragments and soil samples with newer technology that had not been available 8 years prior. Then, late one cold afternoon, the detective called me. His voice was flat, professional. "We found DNA on some of the restraints," he said. I remember the way the room suddenly seemed too bright. The clatter of a coffee cup in the background was a distant, meaningless sound. The DNA matched a living person, someone previously on file for an unrelated minor offense. The name wasn't Briggs. It was someone else, someone I recognized too well, Coach Reynolds. When I was a kid, Coach Reynolds was a giant figure in my life. He taught me to run faster, to shoulder past fear on the field, to tie my cleats without whining. He used to clap me on the back and call me kiddo in a way that made me want to be better. He'd been with the school for years, a hero in the community who had led teams and mentored boys. The idea that his DNA could be on restraints used to hold Jason and Michael made my head spin. It felt like betrayal so deep it would never heal. It also explained a lot. Why certain people had defended the administration so fiercely, why some records were conveniently misplaced, and why the principal had been so quick to deflect blame. The arrest of Coach Reynolds was a spectacle that split the town down the middle. Some people refused to believe it. How could a coach, a man who'd hugged their sons after touchdown, be capable of such depravity? Others looked at him with a new horror, the hero mask slipping to expose rot. Families argued at kitchen tables, friendships fractured, and the high school stadium, where so many of us had felt invincible under Friday night lights, seemed to sag under the weight of the revelations. Reynolds maintained his innocence in public, voice steady, eyes wet with something that might have been regret or fear. His lawyer threatened lawsuits and accused us of manufacturing evidence. The line between truth and accusation grew perilously thin, and I felt the world teeter on it. But the more the detectives dug, the more the web unraveled. Witnesses came forward, boys who had been uncomfortable in his presence, an assistant coach who remembered seeing him near the basement on a suspicious afternoon, even a former student who described a clandestine key Reynolds had used to access locked doors. The journal entries tied to Briggs began to look less like a single-man operation and more like a network of people who enabled each other. Watchers who turned away, hands that closed when they should have opened. Briggs, it turned out, had been a cog, not the whole machine. Reynolds's DNA was on restraints. Briggs had the access. Others had the motive to keep quiet. The picture that formed wasn't neat or satisfying. It was layered, ugly, and all too human. When Reynolds was finally indicted, the town erupted into a chaos that felt biblical. Protests, vigils, and denunciations filled the days. I watched as his face, once so familiar, was plastered on television, as people whom I had known my whole life shouted at him across news cameras. I felt vindicated, yes, but vindication tasted like ash. In court, Reynolds's defense tried to paint me and Sarah as conspirators, motivated by old grudges. They tore at Sarah's credibility, dredged up things from our past, tried to punch holes in the fragile armor of our evidence. It was brutal, public, and intimate in a way that made my throat close. But the ledger, the journal, the DNA, and the witnesses began to stack into something that could not be easily dismissed. And through it all, I realized something else, something that had nothing to do with courtrooms and indictments. I realized that returning truth to a place that had been built on silence required more than exposing monsters. It required rebuilding trust. The town would not heal overnight. Families who had once cheered had to reconcile with the knowledge that their cheers had sometimes masked darkness. Teachers had to learn to listen. Administrators had to be held accountable. The process would be slow and imperfect, but it had begun. For the first time in 8 years, I felt the impossible, a sense of movement, not away from grief, but through it. There was still one paragraph left to write in the story, one final revelation, one last reckoning that would either close the wound or leave it raw forever. I didn't know then exactly how it would end. All I knew was that the fire had done more than expose bones in the field. It had ignited a truth no one could smother. And as winter tightened its grip and the courtroom prepared for a trial that would lay naked our town's secrets, I braced myself for what was to come, praying that whatever came next would honor Jason and Michael in the way they deserved. The trial of Coach Reynolds began in the spring of 2013, nearly 9 years after Jason and Michael vanished. By then, the world had changed. Smartphones everywhere, social media buzzing, news trucks with satellite dishes parked outside the courthouse like vultures waiting to feed. But inside that courtroom, time seemed to collapse. The air was stale, the walls the same dull beige I remembered from municipal offices of my childhood. And at the front sat Reynolds, broad-shouldered still, hair grayer but eyes steady, wearing the same mask of authority he had worn when I was a boy chasing footballs across a muddy field. It was surreal, almost unbearable, to watch him sit there as though he still belonged among us, while the weight of our lost friends pressed down on every wooden bench. The prosecution laid out the case piece by piece, the ledger showing Briggs's access, the journal hinting at control, the DNA tying Reynolds to restraints found in the ash of the field. Witnesses spoke, former students, staff members, even Sarah, who trembled but stood firm as she described seeing Jason and Michael led away that afternoon. I sat there, fists clenched, heart rattling in my chest, feeling both pride and guilt as her voice carried through the chamber. My own turn came too. The prosecutor asked me to explain why I had kept digging all those years, why I hadn't let go when everyone else told me to. My throat tightened, but I told them the truth, that Jason and Michael were more than names in a file, more than memories lost to dust. They were my brothers in everything but blood, and when you lose brothers, you don't stop searching. You either find them or you die trying. My words wavered, but I meant every syllable. The defense fought back viciously. They painted Reynolds as a scapegoat, a victim of hysteria whipped up by grief and conspiracy theories. They questioned the chain of custody on the DNA, sowed doubt about the journal's authenticity, and hammered at Sarah until her hands shook on the stand. They suggested Briggs had acted alone, that if crimes had been committed at all, they were his and his alone. Watching Reynolds's lawyer tear at Sarah's testimony was like swallowing glass. I wanted to shout, to stand and shield her, but all I could do was sit there, feeling the weight of silence, the same silence that had buried Jason and Michael for nearly a decade. Despite everything, the jury listened. Day after day, they watched as puzzle pieces were forced into place, some jagged, some blurred, but all pointing toward Reynolds. The prosecution argued that he had not worked alone, that Briggs and others had been his enablers, but Reynolds was the one whose authority and trust had allowed the crimes to happen. And when the verdict came, after endless days of testimony and nights where I stared at ceilings wondering if justice was even possible, the word guilty rang out. Guilty on multiple counts of kidnapping, guilty on charges tied to unlawful confinement, guilty on evidence tampering. The room gasped, half in relief, half in fury. Reynolds sat motionless, jaw clenched, a man finally stripped of the mask he had worn for so long. But justice is never clean. Briggs was gone, dead years before the trial. Others who might have known more slipped away untouched. their secrets buried with them. The sentences handed down to Reynolds could not bring Jason and Michael back, could not fill the void left in our lives, could not erase the years of silence and fear. Some in the town still refused to believe, still called us liars, still muttered that the fire had been a curse we had brought upon ourselves. And yet, for all its mess and imperfection, the verdict mattered. For the first time, their names were spoken not as a tragedy swept aside, but as boys whose lives had been stolen, boys whose memory deserved truth. After the trial, I found myself wandering back to the field where the fire had burned away the grass, where bones had been unearthed, where everything began again. The ground was scarred, the earth blackened in places, but wildflowers had begun to push through, yellow and white blooms stubborn against the ash. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees, and I thought about Jason's laugh, Michael's stubborn frown, the way the three of us had once believed the world was ours to take. I whispered their names into the open air, not as a prayer but as a promise, that they would not be forgotten, not by me, not by anyone who had heard their story now. Sarah stood beside me, her hand trembling in mine. We had been through fire together, not the literal one that cleared the field, but the fire of truth, the fire of being hunted, the fire of carrying pain that no one wanted to see. We didn't speak much. Words felt too small. But I knew we shared the same resolve, that Crestwood would never again bury its secrets so deep that children could vanish without a trace. The town had been scarred, but scars, I realized, are proof of survival. Years have passed since that trial, yet I still wake some nights drenched in sweat, hearing echoes of laughter and screams tangled together. I still walk past the old school sometimes, now partly boarded up, its halls empty, its basement sealed with heavy locks. But no lock can erase what happened there. No verdict can cleanse it. The truth lives in us who remember, in the families who lost, in the restless air of Crestwood itself. I have learned that grief doesn't end. It only changes shape, from a wound to a scar, from a scream to a story. And stories, once spoken, can outlast even the deepest silence. So I keep telling it. To anyone who will listen, to those who think small towns are safe havens, to those who believe monsters always look like strangers. Jason and Michael were my best friends. They vanished at school in 2004. 8 years later, a fire cleared a field and revealed what silence had tried to hide. It revealed that evil had been among us all along, wearing familiar faces, trusted by our parents, cheered on Friday nights. And though the truth nearly destroyed me, though it cost Sarah and me pieces of ourselves we'll never get back, it also gave Jason and Michael what they were owed, a voice, a reckoning, a legacy that would not let Crestwood forget. And as long as I draw breath, I will keep that promise. Their story is mine now, etched into every word I speak. They will never vanish again.